Let me introduce our three panelists. We have two Japanese academics and one British columnist. Professor Yukari Akeda is political scientist, which is focused on economic relations and especially on European affairs and European Union-Japan negotiations on the economic partnership agreement. Professor Akeda is currently based at the Dokkyo University, and previously she also stayed at Rikyo Law School in Tokyo. She was a visiting scholar in United Kingdom at the St. Anthony's College. Mr. Takashi Hosoda is a Japanese political scientist. He is currently based at Charles University at the Faculty of Social Sciences. He is an expert on the global security issue, and he will be talking about the geopolitical context of the Euro-Japanese rapprochement. And Mr. David Hutt is a British journalist, and he will, in his speech, he will give the introduction of the geopolitical context for the Euro-Japanese relations. So, at first, I would like to ask Professor Akeda for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudolf, for your kind introduction. And good morning, friends. I'm so happy to be here. I flew from Japan, taking more than 24 hours to get here because of this very, very strange situation. But I'm so happy to be here at the very special occasion of 100th anniversary of Czech-Japan relationship, and also the very first anniversary of EPA and SPA. And also, I'm so grateful for you to come to this conference. It is a bit unfortunate situation, but let's turn this situation, very fortunate opportunity for us to know each other, exchange and share the opinions, and discuss for the better future. So I have no slide today. So please check my title of my presentation today. This is recrafting the EU-Japan cooperation. The implication of this title is twofold. First, the word recraft logically presupposes that there already exists substantial system of cooperation between the EU and Japan. Indeed, we have a long history of cooperation. Of course, not such a long, like 100 years of Czech-Japan relations, but since 1990s, the EU and Japan have institutionalized numerous high-level meetings, including the EU-Japan summit, then gradually constructed a complex web of political dialogues in almost all areas. For example, from economic issues to strategy, security, from science and technology to culture. So currently, approximately 40 dialogues exist, according to the European Commission. Approximately suggests that it seems even the Commission doesn't know the exact number of dialogues. But it is true that the EU and Japan have developed a culture of dialogue for a long time. However, second and more essential implication of my title is, although these dialogues are an important asset for the EU-Japan relations, the time has come to review, streamline, or, if necessary, redesign the architecture of cooperation. Why? I would like to point 3 reasons. Reason number 1, as you might already suspect, these political dialogues have been developed in a past dependency manner, not systematically organized way. As a result, even for government officials in both sides, it is quite difficult to see the whole picture and interrelations among these dialogues. There might be duplications, inefficiencies. At the worst, there might be no active dialogues, dead one. For general public, these dialogues and cooperation frameworks are usually invisible, except for limited stakeholders. And many observers have described the EU-Japan cooperation as modest, or low-key, or lukewarm, and lack of concrete results. Not always true, but it could be said that these structural problems partly contributed to such general impressions. Reason number 2, current critical situation in liberal world order is producing a strong demand for more efficient and systematic, result-oriented EU-Japan cooperation. I will come back to this point later. And reason number 3, and the most important one, is in this context, the EU-Japan EPA and SPA were concluded and entered into force last year. These 2 agreements are expected to play crucial roles in recrafting cooperation, and I think they have a great potential. So let me explain the current situation and demand for the EU-Japan cooperation further. The EPA-SPA had come just in time. At the turmoil of liberal trade order, both parties succeeded to deliver substantial trade liberalization, as Mr. Ambassador explained very well. And we sent a very strong message to the world that we would become the last resort in protecting and promoting liberal economic norms and principles. But more importantly, these agreements arrived at the beginning of fundamental transformation of global economic system. And beyond that, a fundamental transformation of our society. 2 biggest engines of transformation are, 1 is digital industrial revolution, and 2, the climate change. The competition among major powers, especially the US and China, over who should lead this transformation and what kind of norms, principles, rules, or even ethics should be adopted, has already started. In this power politics, the EU and Japan could be a powerful and functional normative partners, constitute a third pole against the US and China. Why? Not only because we are sharing basic liberal values, but both parties' policy directions for the future are strikingly identical, although there is substantial difference in approaches, and although not so many people are aware of. The EU's new leadership has launched quite ambitious European Green Deal and the EU Fit for the Digital Age initiative recently. On the part of Japan, the Abe cabinet already adopted the Society 5.0 initiative and the long-term growth strategy under the Paris Agreement. Shared main ideas in these initiatives and strategies are: number one, human-centered approach for digital revolution, which shows quite a contrast against the US business-centric approach and China's state-centric approach. And also the main shared idea is the importance of linking the digital revolution and climate action. The EU and Japan share the belief that economic growth and environmental protection are mutually enforcing and have great positive synergies. As these global challenges deeply interrelated, the EU and Japan need to streamline existing cooperation with a comprehensive and strategic view. Also, this transformation would affect people dramatically, and to make no one left behind, the process of searching for new governance should be inclusive and transparent and accountable. So, in this context, here comes the role of the EPA and SPA. How the EPA, SPA can contribute to the above-mentioned purpose. So let's take a look at the legal and institutional aspect of the agreement. First of all, these two agreements are legally binding treaties, meaning that they give legal base, legal stability, predictability, and to some extent, transparency and accountability to the existing and future cooperation. The SPA is expected to be functioning as a platform of all EU-Japan cooperation. And as for the EPA, platform for all cooperation in the area covered by the EPA, but it could go beyond. Regarding the institutional design, the SPA consists of 55 articles, and in these articles, 41 cooperation areas are stipulated. So, huge, comprehensive framework for cooperation. And as a top institution supervising the SPA, it established the joint committee, basically held at least once a year, monitors implementation of agreement, and finds priority areas of cooperation, and recommends this area to the EU-Japan Summit. Regarding the EPA, it has 23 chapters. And similar to the SPA, it has a joint committee as a top supervising body. And under that, 10 specialized committees and 2 working groups. And the function is the same, monitoring implementation and discussing further cooperation. Among the 9 specialized committee, among 10 specialized committee, 9 committee are focused on their specialized area of coverage, chapter of EPA. But this EPA has one very important chapter and committee, that is cross-cutting regulatory cooperation committee. So in the EPA, while the joint committee supervising all specialized committees and working groups, but this subcommittee level, the cross-cutting regulatory cooperation committee supervising the same level other specialized committees, development and cooperation, and also beyond the EPA, it could discuss and make decision about other regulatory cooperation framework outside the scope of the EPA. So these fundamental structure of joint committee and specialized committee working groups is not special in EU-Japan EPAs. This is kind of basic template structure, all EPAs Japan so far concluded, and EU EPAs has the similar institutional structure. But the important point is this is Japan and EU discussing the future direction of cooperation, and also EU and Japan is quite active to use this institution and already produce certain outcomes. I'll talk this later. So, and also I'd like to add the importance of this institutional arrangement is it is added to transparency and accountability in cooperation debate and framework of EPA, SPA. Because this is because European Union's transparency initiative, the both parties decided to publish all agendas and minutes, negotiation conclusion on the website. And now Japanese public, EU public can see the result and also follow the development of the discussion. So this is a very, very important step and in recrafting EU-Japan cooperation. So let me point out several first-year achievements. The EPA first-year meeting, the EPA Joint Committee's first-year meeting was held last year, March, and discussed the so-called connectivity as priority cooperation. And this discussion resulted in producing the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure in 2019, September. This is the very good example of concrete result of the discussion. And second year meeting this year, the Joint Committee recognized priority areas. One, connectivity and security and digitalization. And also reflecting on the priority of the new leadership of the European Union, they discussed how the EU and Japan could better work together in responding to climate change and upholding the rule-based international order. Regarding the EPA, the first joint committee meeting was held 2019 April. Alongside the general assessment of EPA implementation, relationship with other EU-Japan policy dialogues were discussed. And the joint committee recommended the specialized committees to hold meetings back-to-back with related policy dialogues. And also they further recommended these committees to seek other synergies, including taking up issues identified through the policy dialogues. So they are now taking a first step to recrafting the complex web of EU-Japan dialogues and corporate frameworks. Not only joint committees, but also specialized committee produced certain concrete result. For example, Customs Cooperation Specialist Committee succeeded to simplify more about rules of origin procedures. And Automotive and Parts Working Group also agreed that EU and Japan would cooperate together to creating a new global standard about electric vehicles. This is the selected main achievement of the first year. But there are several challenges, of course. Among them, I'd like to point out one is how to link or coordinate between the EPA and SPA joint committees. These cooperation covered by EPA and SPA are very closely related. Both parties need the careful, coordination. However, there is no legal linkage, no official legal linkage between the EPA and SPA. So constructing a practical linkage is the one challenge. And second challenge is the budget and personnel. It's especially for specialized committee. They are very small committee and consist of unit level, but assigned very big responsibility to coordinate or kind of create inventory check of all existing EU-Japan cooperation. So how to manage these tasks with limited personnel and budget is another challenge. But as for conclusion, EU and Japan has a great asset, a stock of dialogues and cooperation frameworks. And it is the base that we can recraft and redesign the architecture for the future society. And in my opinion, the first round of work and discussion has just begun, but it shows the very, very promising steps. And most importantly, when I interviewed many officials actually attending the committee, they showed a very strong will and enthusiasm to coordinate and recrafting cooperation for the new global challenges. And finally, I'd like to point out now the transparency and accountability process has introduced. The citizens, stakeholders of EU and Japan can monitor and can assess the development or the way of managing the cooperation. So I think it's just started, but it has it has great expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yukari, for explaining the motivations and dynamics of the rapprochement between European Union and Japan. It's for sure that Japan is less visible stakeholder because the political debates and media are obsessed with China, with rising China and Sino-European agenda. And Japan, it's sometimes overlooked, but still it still belongs to the top 4 global economics. USA, China, European Union, and Japan are the key European economic leaders. For the discussion about this topic, you mentioned many important circumstances. I think that many aspects in geopolitics will resonate in the following presentations that would define the Japanese somehow uneasy position because of the decades, 2 decades lasting economic stagnation, the challenge of the recalibration of the American foreign policies, especially in the Asia-Pacific area, the United States withdrawal from the multilateral organization of Trans-Pacific partnership that actually created the international vacuum in Asia, which is now used by assertive and ambitious China. That seems that these all drive the Japan to be more active and to be searching for international strong allies, which of the European Union, which has actually no hard power in Asia Pacific, but still European Union is an economic power. I'm just very curious about the process of negotiation between European Union and Japan, because I cannot imagine how it works in practical. What is the practical aspect of this? I believe that there must, if such the huge project like the European Partnership Agreement between Japan and European Union, the final agreement include many compromises, and negotiating compromise it's always difficult for all. May I ask the discussion by asking you how far Japan must sacrifice by negotiating with European Union? What's the problem with European Union? Or how far the European Union is sometimes uneasy for the Japanese negotiating position? Or what is the? You mentioned that there are some challenges. This is the that are the difficulties to coordination and management. Could you introduce how the negotiations are being held? Is there any special commission on the level of European Union? This is a special commission for negotiation with Japan, or is the negotiation on the level of European Commission? Thank you.
Thank you, Rudolf. My background is researcher, academic, but actually during the EU-Japan EPA negotiations, I joined as Japanese negotiation team from 2015 to the end of 2017, and I witnessed the actual negotiation process. and how both parties concluded this agreement. And important factor is, as I point out, that the timing was very important, and we have a crucial deadline to conclude this EPA, SPA by the end of 2017. And after that, if we conclude it at that point, it could be ratified and enter into force in 2019. This is the crucial, opportunity, because after that, before we created a very, very friendly, close working relationship for 5 years with the Commission and also European Parliament. But after 1929, there will be a new leadership, the European Union, and a new European Parliament. So for us, this is the big motivation. Anyway, and with all effort, we will finish this agreement by 2017. And this process, in the beginning, Japan was a very weak negotiator against the European Union, because this particularly EPA is Japan asked for EU to negotiate. The main motivation is economic one. The Korea already negotiated and concluded the EU-Korea agreement. That made Japan very, very weak competition position in world trade, especially in terms of automobile. So this, the first, position in the negotiation stick for a long time. But in the end, the European Union also shared the urgency to conclude this negotiation. So European Union also compromised a lot. But that doesn't mean the content of EPA and SPA is not enough. We decided to stipulate future provisions in the actual text of EPA, SPA. So the topics and subjects we couldn't negotiate, we couldn't compromise by the end of negotiation. We stipulated this subject into the text and continue to talk, continue to negotiate to the future. So this cooperation, rebuilding cooperation structure is also part of this future section of the EPA.
Thank you. It's very valuable having Yukari Akeda here due to her experience with the negotiation practices. And now we have time for questions and comments to Professor Akeda. Those who ask the questions, please be kind and introduce yourself and your affiliation. So are there any questions? Or some
an additional comment by myself. I learned that the Czech Republic also finding the new way of economic development. Your country is main, industrial sector is manufacturing, automotive, and electronics. But the beginning of the digital economy, your country is finding the resources to shift more high-tech sectors. And Japan also in the past, heavily dependent on the manufacturing and also automotive industries. So seeking the new way of development and also facing the fourth industrial revolution, Czech Republic and Japan, also the European Union, share how to construct fundamental norms and principles, not the surface of a game of rules, but the fundamental understanding, sharing is the very important. And Czechia and Japan is, in that sense, it's very promising partners. Thank you.
Czech economy is very strongly dependent on the car production, and when we face the new situation, when the European Union agreed a free trade, signed a free trade agreement both with South Korea and in Japan, that means that the imports of Korean and Japanese cars must appear in the European market. So this is quite a relevant competition for the Czech car makers. But I don't think that there will be some strong Japan or Korea critical lobby. So I don't believe that it would be a serious lobby issue. Are there some comments or questions in the audience? So if not, we will continue and come back to the topic of Professor Yukari Akeda later, when we summarize all the presentations. And now I will ask Takashi Hosoda for presentation on the geopolitical security context of the European Union-Japan rapprochement. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much, everybody, who come today. My topic is a little bit different from the Professor Akeda, and I would like to focus on more the security issues, and especially the maritime security. The maritime security is one of the very important to cooperate between Japan and European Union. I mean, they include the European countries. And here is my outline of today's presentation. At first, I would like to introduce you the maritime security situation in Indo-Pacific currently situation. And of course, I know the maritime security includes so many issues like fishing controls, environmental protections, or anti-piracy. But I focus on mainly today the interstate dispute resolution, and also the sea lane of the communication protection, and so many issues related with national security. And of course, I know you may know that the European Union is originally not a defense or security organization, but I hope Japan and European Union or European country can promote and increase the cooperation in the defense field and the security fields, not only this economy or from the politics. And then I introduce you the Japan's current approach to the Indo-Pacific. Of course, this Indo-Pacific is also it's a very, very difficult to term. Every country has different definition. But here, I use the Japan definition. And the current European, Japanese security and defense cooperation, I will explain you. And then I attempt to analyze current, Japan, EU, or Japan, European countries, security and defense cooperation with quasi-alliance by the Victor Charles theory to evaluate the current situation. And I would like to point out the limitation of the current cooperation between Japan and European country. And then I offer you the future perspective of the cooperation. I hope to increase and promote these kind of the cooperation. Okay, so, yep. Okay, thank you very much. This is a map of the Indo-Pacific. I mean, in Japan, the Japanese government used the Indo-Pacific region as connectivity, an importance of the connectivity between Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean, and also the connect between Asia and African countries. Okay? So, and this highlighted red circle means the American facilities and the bases, military facilities and bases. And here, there are so many problems related with maritime security and also the defense in the region. For example, yeah. Here, you can find, for example, in the East China Sea, since 2008, the Japan and China once signed the joint cooperation, but after the Japan side captured the Chinese fishermen around the Senkaku Isles in 2010, unfortunately, China continues to develop unilaterally the underground resources and the sea resources. And also, the Senkaku Isles is what Daoyu in Chinese is a quite serious territorial dispute between Japan and China in East China, so very close to the Okinawa or Taiwan. Then, yeah. Here is the exploratory isles. You may know, for example, the Scarborough Shoal is a territorial dispute between Philippines and China. And currently, almost 450 days, China deploys fishing boats, almost 200 fishing boats around the Scarborough Shoals, and to blockade to access the Philippine side. Then, oops. Everything? Okay. Don't move. Okay, sorry. Yeah. No.
I can't change it here. It will be easier, I guess.
No, I use it. Sorry, the trouble. But which direction should I?
This one?
This one? No.
It doesn't work, I guess. The controller doesn't work, so basically I need to change it.
I see. Two more return, please. No, return. Back, sorry.
This one?
No, two more back, please. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and the last year, especially since the July last year, and to the end of August, China deploys the Chinese Coast Guard ships and the fishing boat in Vietnamese EEZ because Vietnam allowed to develop the oil rigs. It's a higher, the Japanese oil rig, but hired by Russian oil company or gas company in East China Sea within the Vietnamese EEZ. Next, please. And also, you can find now, at the end of last year, the Chinese Coast Guard ship arrived with the Chinese fishing boats, several fishing boats around Natuna Island. It's belong to Indonesia, but China insisted here is almost 90% of South China Sea as a Chinese territory with the 9-dash line, so-called the 9-dash line. And please. Yeah, and now, for example, at the beginning of February this year, Malaysia deployed the oil rig in the Malaysia's EEZ, but of course, China deployed the Coast Guard ships and with fishing boats and to disturb the activities. So please. And you can find that China deploys a research ship within the, for example, the EEZ within EEZ of the Papua New Guinea without the permission, without the announcement. Please. And also now Chinese research ship also continue now. Today also continue to research the undersea, underground resources and also the shapes of the undersea very close to the Australia. And the Australian authority is very, very concerned because this area is a typical way of the Australian submarine to pass the Indian Ocean. So that's why now China tried to make some map. So please. Yeah, and China also continued to the research activities in Indian Ocean. Next, please. And you can find the beginning of the February, China and Myanmar agreed to research the EEZ of Myanmar by Chinese research ship. Please. Yeah, so in a sense, this gray dots mean the Marshall Islands and Kiribati. You may know that last year, finally, China pushed these two countries and switched the diplomatic relationship from Taiwan to China, right? Please. Yeah, and also not only these maritime issues, but also the nuclear proliferation of the North Korea, and please. Yeah, the Taiwan issues, another traditional threat in the region. Yes, please. Yeah, and also that this yellow one showed you the location of the terrorism, especially the Muslim terrorism in the Philippines, please, and in Asia, and please, and in Malaysia, and also, so please, here is a Strait of Malacca. It's a quite important choke point to access those almost all ships, and here is a piracy issues still exist. So please. And this circle showed you that China's anti-ship ballistic missile, the F-21, this is a firing range from the Hainan Islands. So they can attack, so theoretically they can attack from Chinese territory to the almost all South China Sea, or the ships on the South China Sea. Yeah, so please. And the next, please. Yeah, it's the same circles from the Chinese territory. And so please. Next one is another type of Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile, the DF-26. It's a more wider firing range from China, right? So that's why inland China theoretically can attack every US ships or Japanese ships in the very, very close to the from Chinese coast to the South China Sea or Western Pacific region. So please. Yeah, and another one, please. Yeah. So this in this image showed you that now China is on the way to establish the control the offshore of China. So that's why the last year the Australia Law Institute published now the American hegemony and American military presence is eroded. So next, please. Yeah, thank you very much. And this line showed you the international date line. And 20th of February this year, for the first time, China conducted naval activity eastern part from the international date line. It means very close to the Hawaii, China conducted a naval exercise. So that's why, for the first time, and of course the US authority was very shocked. So in that sense, you can see that now China tried to expand not only the activity, but also the influential sphere to the ocean, Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. So please. And another quite important issue or a problem for us is, that China, especially current Chinese authority believes that might makes right approach and might mean the military capability, right? And also utilize the current international law and the law system that every international system under the US hegemony, China enjoys and utilizes, but challenges to international law, and that with their own interpretation. For example, their own interpretation of the UNCLOS, the seal of the law. So it's a kind of another challenge by China to our common value and the common norms. And also China offer the Chinese socialism style or model with a very, very huge amount of money, fund, to the developing countries. So next, please. And also the another problem is the United States is very unpredictable ability of the U.S. security commitment, especially under the Trump administration. He is always, prefer to push the America First policy. And also the America First means that sometimes that they prefer to contain China amid a great power competition period. So in this period, especially Japan and European countries need to prevent this kind of containment China, and also the great power competition makes or comes to the real, actual hot war, right? So next, please. And this map shows you the maritime shipping route. This red lines show you the maritime route, and you can find between European countries and Japan. And especially Japan depends on almost 99.95% of oil import from Middle East. So that's why we need to secure the sea lane of the communication from the Middle East through the Indian Ocean, past the Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, and Taiwan Strait to Japan. And also, the European countries heavily depends on this sea lane of the communications from Mediterranean through the Suez Canal to the Red Sea to Indian Ocean. Okay, so next, please. And this graph shows you the European Union's dependency of sea lift. The red shows you the sea lift, and the other shows you the, for example, airplane and road and railway and the other ways. So that's why you can find, for example, 2018, European Union heavily depends on the sea lift by 55% of the export and 47% of import. So that's why, yeah, of course, you may know that during the past 5 years, we heard about the China, between China and European countries have the direct railway transportation, but still this, total amount of the railway transportation is very, very limited. And it heavily depends on the ship because it's quite cheap to transport so many goods. Please. And then you mentioned, this table shows you that EU's major trade partners, of course, United States, China, and ASEAN. It's a top 3. It's the figure of the 2018. And Japan is number 7, and South Korea, and India. So in this sense, not only Japan, but also the European countries had a common threat perception and a common, the standpoint to cooperate, especially the sea lane of communication defense. Okay, so please. And that Japan's approach to the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific means, for example, Japan introduced a high-quality infrastructure partnership and also free and open Indo-Pacific strategies. It consists of 3 major pillars. 1, the promotion of the international rules and norms, and then the pursuit of economic prosperity through the hard and soft connectivity. I mean, the hard connectivity means infrastructure, railway, highway, and so on. And the soft connectivity means the education. It's very important to emphasize the importance by the Japanese government to train the people in the developing country. And then the commitment for peace and stability, I mean the capacity building, through the capacity building. Capacity building means to help and to support the Asian countries, African countries, to donate, for example, the Coast Guard ships and educate their staffs and so on. So please. And also the Vientiane vision is from the defense side. Minister of Defense from Japan promote the Obienchen vision for defense cooperation. And defense cooperation meant that to use the military capability and assets to cooperate each other, not to fight each other, but cooperate each other. And also the promoting this multilateralism through the once the Japan tried ASEAN +3 and the East Asian Summit, and free trade framework through the TPP originally, then the CPTPP, and now the negotiation of RCEP, right? And through these kind of the multilateralism, the Japan and the European Union can share these kind of the multilateralism is quite important basis. Please. So in a sense, I can point out that the Japan's goals, so many goals through the Indo-Pacific. The first, the most important point here, the strengthen Japan-US alliance. Of course, you may know that Japan heavily depends on the United States, the national security and defense. So in a sense, how to secure the American commitment to Japan is the most important point for Japan's foreign policy and Japan's defense. And the next one is opposite side. Yeah, of course, for Japan, the United States is quite important, but too heavily dependent on the United States is quite makes vulnerable. So in the sense that hedging to excessive dependency on US is also quite important. So in the sense, it's the balance between this alliance and the strategic autonomy of Japan, or seeking of this autonomy, is quite important way of the current Japan's foreign policy and defense policy. And especially this hedging to the dependency on the US, Japan can cooperate with European Union. And in this sense, European Union also had this kind of the fear of the abandonment or entrapment by United States, right? I will later explain this. And also proactive contribution with the ODA, Official Development Assistance and Defense Diplomacy among the ASEAN countries and African countries. And the proactive protecting freedom of the communication and keep the international norms and rules as freedom of navigation, and securing the free trade. It's quite important and vital for Japan. That Japan is trade depending country, and the European Union also. So that's why these Japan's target or goals through the Indo-Pacific strategy or concept, that we have so many issues can cooperate each other. So please. And here, the table shows you the current Japan-European cooperation, and especially this table shows you the cooperation, defense and security cooperation between Japan and European countries, not the European Union, because the European Union is originally not a defense organization. So, and then here, the left side, I explained, for example, from the up, foreign and defense ministry meeting is so-called 2+2 meetings, and the European countries, with France and the United Kingdom, we have the 2+2 track. And otherwise, non-European countries is the Quad, so-called the Quad countries. Quad means the Japan, United States, Australia, and India, right? And non-Quad countries. And from the next one is the joint research and development cooperation and defense-related equipment technologies. It's a bilateral cooperation between Japan and the United Kingdom and France. And also agreement of transferring the defense-related equipment and technologies. Japan signed a bilateral agreement between with United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Germany. It's very interesting. It's now that Germany also, start increasing their commitment to Asia. It's surprising for me, for example, that when I visited the Hanoi International Conference last November, the Germany side, the German government also dispatched some staffs and experts about international laws to support the Vietnamese negotiation of the code of conduct. So in a sense, now that Germany also starts increasing the commitment to the Asian issues. And next one is the General Security and Military Information Agreement, so-called GSOMIA. It's the bilateral agreement to protect the quite important military information and to share the military information. And between Japan, NATO, France, United Kingdom, and Italy signed this kind of bilateral agreement. And the last one is acquisition and cross-service agreement, so-called ACSA. It means the agreement, bilateral agreement, and if the country signed this agreement, that both countries can share the fuel and the food and the waters between their armies. So, and this kind of the bilateral agreement or negotiations, and of course, for example, currently the observation of North Korea's ship-to-ship cargo transfer in East China Sea, these kind of quite important activities participated the United Kingdom and France, and other countries, for example, United States and so on. And also, in European side, for example, European Union finally established enhanced EU security cooperation in and with Asia in May 2018. And according to this paper, that they emphasized and put importance that terrorism, the counter-terrorism, maritime security, cyber security, and crisis management. And then European Union offered a tailor-made security cooperation with 5 states, 5 Asian states. I mean India, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So in the sense that now the European Union had this kind of framework to cooperate with Asian partners, and also already the importance of the EU-Japan SPA, the Professor Akeda and also the Ambassador Shimazaki pointed out. And especially I would like to focus on the contents of the SPA. First, in the preamble of this SPA, they emphasize the importance of the peaceful solution of disputes. The peaceful solution of dispute is a very, very good match for Japan's pacifism and Japan's pacifist constitution, war renouncing constitution, right? And also rule of law, it's Article 1 of the SPA. And then the importance of the crisis management in the Article 4, and with the Article 5 is a prevention of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and cooperation for counterterrorism in the maritime security with Article 29, and the cyber security and cyber domain with Article 36. The next, please. Yeah, thank you. And now I try to apply this quasi-alliance theory. It means that the definition of the quasi-alliance, an alignment between 2 states, they remains unallied despite sharing de facto common ally. The picture points out the possibility that this de facto alliance without official treaty, without official agreement, but de facto the sharing, the threat, and so on. And he applies the cases between Japan and South Korea. And he pointed to 3 points. At that time, not now, but at the time, I mean that you're around 1999 or before, the South Korea and Japan could share the threat perception. I mean the common threat as the North Korea is a common threat, right? And also they have the common underwriter. It means who is the owner or who is the main organizer of the security cooperation. Of course, it's the United States. And please, next one. Yeah, thank you. The United States has a security agreement or a defense treaty. For example, between United States and South Korea, it depends on the defense treaty in 1951, then change the different type of the defense treaty after the ceasefire agreement of the Korean War in 1953. And depending on this treaty, U.S. Force Korea deploys and stationed in Korea. And in the case of Japan, The security treaty, originally the old version of the security treaty signed in 1951, and the new current security treaty signed in 1960. And according to, and thanks to this treaty, the United States deployed and stationed the U.S. force in Japan. But you can find that this is a so-called hub and spoke relations. This is not a network. There is no security cooperation. There is no defense cooperation between Japan and South Korea. Always it is a bilateral basis and a hub and spoke. And always the United States is a hub, right? So it's a totally different of the European cases. In Europe, you have the NATO. But so in a sense, being motivated by the behavior by each user, why they cannot? They could share the threat perception. And the United States also pushed both sides to cooperate. But why they cannot, or they could not share, and they could not cooperate in defense and security between Japan and South Korea? Because the past historic experience, especially the animosity and the rivalry between Japan and South Korea. But Victor Chai points out that there is a possibility to cooperate because sharing the fear of the abandonment. Here, for example, the Schneider describes this as a security dilemma. That every minor allies in the security organizations or security alliance have the fear of the abandonment or entrapment. Right? And here, in the cases, the Japan and South Korea can share the fear of the abandonment. One day, the United States abandoned these minor allies. So this key factor to drive South Korea and Japan to contribute to the United States. And also United States make Japan and South Korea contest how they can contribute to the United States. Who is a better allies, partners? Who is a better host nation supporter or something? So in that sense, in the case now between Japan and European countries, common threat, for example, but we cannot share the common threat, for example. Some European countries, for some European countries, Russia is the primary threat, but other European country, for example, France, for France, the Sahel situation is more important than the Russian situation, right? And also for Japan, China is a quite serious threat, but our risks. But in Europe, there is no mono or single threat perception of China. So in that sense, the other hand, we can share, for example, we can share the threat of so-called non-traditional threat, like nuclear proliferation by North Korea, by Iran, or maritime security, cyber security, and crisis management. So in this sense, in this field, we can cooperate each other, right? And also the common underwriter, of course, United States. It is not possible to deny. Even European countries heavily depends on the US in NATO, right? And so that's why President Trump intimidated European countries to increase spending inside the NATO. So that's why now the United States under the Trump administration prefer to more great power competition. It's a kind of the nostalgia of the Cold War. But for them, especially for them, it's a very, very good situation to express the U.S. might and the U.S. leadership, right? So in that sense, the Japan and the European Union and the European countries heavily depends on, and we can share the fear of abandonment or fear of entrapment. So that's why in this point, we can also cooperate each other. And then the behavior of each other, the fear of abandonment or entrapment, especially the entrapment, is now quite serious for European countries. In the case of Strait of Hormuz and Gulf, when the United States asked the European countries to deploy the frigate and escort ships for the maritime security, finally Germany and other countries denied. And France initiated and started European lead maritime operation in Strait of Hormuz in mid of February, right? So in the sense that between Japan and European countries, no animosity and sharing values, common values. And also, some experts point out that the Japan and the European countries possibly be a competitor over the U.S. military presence. But I think in this point, I don't worry about this competition because the U.S. force Europe consists mainly U.S. Army. But U.S. force Japan mainly consists of Marine Corps and Navy. So that's why it is possible to demarcate and use the U.S. military presences and share these kind of the values. One of the problem is proximities. Between Japan and Europe, there is a quite wide distance. So that's why we cannot promote for the quasi-alliance or alignment, but we could, and both would be complementary partners. But of course, the both side is not prepared because, so please. There are so many limitations. Please, for example, the different national interests in the Pacific regions. This table shows you the share of, share of Japan's foreign foreign direct investment in ASEAN. Japan, 13.2%. Japan's total foreign direct investment, but to the ASEAN, or around 13%. But in the case of, for example, Germany, only 1.7%, Great Britain 1.4%, and France 1.3%, right? And also the share of the ASEAN in total ODA by each countries. Yeah, of course, the Australia, almost 40% of their ODA to the ASEAN. But in the case of European countries, only 2.6% by for Germans ODA to ASEAN. And also the share of the ASEAN in total trade for each country is, Japan had almost 15% of share. ASEAN had almost 15% of share in Japan's trade. So that's why, but in this sense, the European countries, the share of the ASEAN or Indo-Pacific is relatively smaller than the Japan's one. And also, in the limitation of the intentions, for example, thank you. United Kingdom insists, for example, the global Britain, right? But in this sense, United Kingdom and France also, under the President Macron, they try to achieve the grandeur. But in the case of Germany, Spain, Italy, or Poland, they don't have this kind of grand strategy, the worldwide or global strategies. And also, European Union global strategy is signed that 2016, desire to be a security provider. European Union should be a security provider, but basically their capability, their preparation is so-called Petersburg tasks. It is for the non-traditional threat and peacekeeping operation and so on, right? And also, for example, during the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in 2016, the France defense minister at the time, Le Drian, emphasized the importance of the European regular and visible presence in the Pacific or Asia. But frankly speaking, and also some official staff of COASI. It means the working group of the Council of European Union, and that this working group on Asia and Oceanic. This special working group is responsible to shape and negotiate the European Union's relations with Asia. And this COASI staff offshore on the French ship, and this French ship participated so-called freedom of FONOP operation through the South China Sea in 2018. So that's why the European countries and the European Union also start and increase this commitment to the Asian security. But still, it is no consensus on China policy in European Union, and also the division of the COASI and the COAFURI and ACP. It means that in the European Union, there is no official Indo-Pacific strategy. There is no official view or common view of the Indo-Pacific. Even in European Union, there is no official use of the term of the Indo-Pacific, right? It's totally in the European Union separated. The Asia issues is the Asia working group, and African issues is the special working group for African issues and so on. And also the limitation of the military might. So please. This table shows you the naval capability. It means the CB means the aircraft carrier and the surface naval vessels and submarines. In the case of the UK, there are one aircraft carrier and 21 surface naval vessels, including destroyer, frigate, and replenishment oiler. And in the case of France, one aircraft carrier, 29 surface ships, and 9 submarines. And Germany, no aircraft carrier, 20 surface combatant, and 6 submarines in a sense, and so on. And also, the fixed-wing anti-submarine warfare patrol aircraft is quite limited, the capability, especially due to the end of the Cold War. And post-Cold War, the European country reduced the investment to this anti-submarine warfare. During the Cold War, they have the huge amount of airplane and anti-submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare destroyers and frigate. But after the end of the Cold War, they retired and they shrinked the total number of these frigate destroyers and airplanes. And also military bases. Only United Kingdom had the kind of the military base in Brunei in ASEAN. And now the UK government wonder that another military bases in Singapore or not. But otherwise, only France had the military bases in New Caledonia. But New Caledonia is quite far off from the ASEAN, right? Almost 5,600 kilometers from ASEAN countries. So that's why it's quite far away. But other European countries don't have these kind of military facilities in ASEAN. And legal basis of the deployment. For example, United Kingdom had a so-called five powers defense agreement with Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. But otherwise, France had the overseas forces in the New Caledonia and the French Polynesia. They have some obligation and commitment. But otherwise, the other European countries, they don't have this kind of legal basis. So that's why, fortunately, no EU policy on Indo-Pacific and naval diplomacy by members. The current EU or current European naval diplomacy depends on the contribution by each member countries. And now, after the Brexit, the capability of the European Union should decrease, right? And this table shows you the current situation, the current participation of the European countries in every sphere. For example, the security to solve the security dilemma, there is no cooperation between Japan and the European countries. And also in the national defense sphere, it is no cooperation. And the systems of the communication defense or disturbing the systems of the communication, possibly we can cooperate each other. For example, in the west coast of the Africa and the Middle East, already European countries deployed the frigates or their naval capabilities. And once through the South China Sea and Pacific Ocean, United Kingdom and France deployed their frigates and their naval ships and to join the joint naval drill and exercise with United States, Japan, and Australia. But only UK and France. And now the UK is after the Brexit. It is not the European Union members. So that's why the limitation should be very, very limited. And also the joint infrastructure project and ODA coordination, still there is no coordination. Yeah. The last year, finally, the European Union and Japan signed a partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure last September. But still, we need to add a substantial cooperation to these words. So that's why, what can Japan expect to European countries or European Union? The first one is ensuring the rules of law and freedom of navigation, these kind of common values and rules and norms. And denying might makes a right approach by China. Then the protecting rules-based trade and free trade and avoid a containment China by United States is another quite important task for us. Then the supporting capability building of the ASEAN countries, and especially the ASEAN countries and China try to establish so-called code of conduct by 2021. And first reading, they need 3 readings, and the first reading they took last year. So that's why this year, the second reading should be take hold, and the third reading is the next year maybe. And this year, the Vietnam is chairmanship of the ASEAN. So that's why that this year, maybe the progress is I think that quite less progress. So that's why the Japan and European countries need to support them and advise them. And also the cost imposing to China by EU or European countries to this discipline in Beijing. It means that not only to come the European frigate or European naval forces to Asia, but within the European Union, within Europe, EU can do the very, very positive and very important role to discipline Beijing, especially, for example, to strengthen the regulation related to foreign direct investment to European Union is one of the way to cooperate. And also the offering alternative now the One Belt, One Road by China through the ODA coordinations. And I highly expect these kind of the cooperations. And 26th of EU-Japan summit last April, the EU President at the time, Mr. Tusk, describes current situation, current cooperation between Japan and European Union. And Japan and EU stand side by side. And now is a very primitive and very fast standpoint, but we can increase and we can promote and we can encourage the further cooperation for not only from the economic sphere, but also the defense and security sphere. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Takashi. You brought us from the field of economic cooperation more into the hard power field. But this is very urgent situation that cannot be missed. We have some minutes for discussion. Let me ask a question. Japan is very strongly dependent on the support from the United States and is exposed to the challenge of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very strong political and economic burden. May I ask you about the activity of President Trump, who called for talks the North Korean leader Kim, because it must be understood in Japan as a let's say mixed message about the U.S. commitment to fulfill its role of the security supervisor. Was that issuing any doubts of the U.S. position vis-à-vis the security bilateral cooperation with Japan?
Thank you very much. Rudolf. I think, yeah, of course it's true, and I totally agree with you. And the most biggest concern for Japanese side in the case of the North Korean crisis is I already told you the fear of the abandonment. I think once the President Trump compromise and to make some deal with North Korea, and for example, to only stop the development of ICBM. And for the United States, it's quite enough, because without this ICBM, the North Korea cannot attack the mainland of the United States. But still, the North Korea has a short-range missile and a medium-range ballistic missiles with nuclear tip. So in this sense, this kind of the compromise is quite serious concern for Japanese side. But the other hand, as far as I know, the Prime Minister Abe, the current Japanese administration, is very, very close cooperation with United States and Trump administration, and especially Prime Minister Abe pushed the abduction issues, the quite important issue for Japanese side, and to put this information to the President Trump. So that's why, thanks to this push, as far as I know, at the beginning of the Trump-Kim summit in Hanoi, President Trump once, at first, he mentioned and asked Mr. Kim the issue of the abduction. So that's why this kind of cooperation is quite effective. But the other hand, always the Japan has this kind of fear of the abandonment. So that's why how to resolve and how to reduce this kind of fear of the abandonment, we need this. And one of the possibility is to hedge this kind of the heavier dependency of the security on United States and switch from the some part of this kind of the dependency on European countries. Thank you.
Any questions in the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, for your very instructive presentation. You focused on Hutt, especially, but you living here in Czech Republic, you are aware of growing concern here in the EU member states and also in the UK about the threat posed by disinformation and cyber activities coming from, let's say, it's not a secret, China and Russian Federation. And that was what you face these threats, and second, there is a dialogue or, let's say, incipient cooperation on this issue with Japan, countries or EU as a whole.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's quite. Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very important questions. Yeah, of course, Japan also faces this kind of disinformation, not only from China, but also North Korea and Russia and other countries. And especially during the current new type of the coronavirus flu, there's some information or disinformation from China try to spread in Japanese society. So in the sense, Japan and the European Union had this kind of the cooperation, especially the cyber cooperation and crisis management and cyber cooperation. And through these cooperations, both sides exchange the information and how to deal. And not only the European Union, Japan also had this kind of the consultation with NATO. So that's why this information and also cyber attack is quite serious. And so many Japanese companies are now attacked and leaked at quite important, defense-related technologies and so on. It's quite serious. So that's why, of course, it's a very important in addition to the maritime security, but this security, cyber security is also quite important for Japan. Thank you.
Next question, please. No comments, no questions. May I ask you, Takashi? Yep. I might fail to catch your meaning that the position of the European Union on the containment of China. That, if I understand well, the European Union does not support such a tough measures, which are conducted by somebody else. European Union never declared containment of China. This is because it cannot play such a role. European Union, it's a soft power, superpower. So this is actually the position of European Union, that openly does not declare the containment of China, but secretly it's expected. Brussels is expecting the USA to continue its post-war commitment to guarantee the peace in Asia Pacific. That includes, let's say, containment, and the containment is, of course, by the American side. It's always counterbalanced by an engagement. Yeah. So using these tools, both tools, this is the monopoly of the US policy. So do I understand it well that actually the containment is understood in European Union, but the European Union is not in position to declare it openly?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally understand, and yeah, of course, I agree with you, and the secretary inside the European Union, this kind of the momentum you have, but officially, in European Union, there is no single China policy, right? And every country has a different perception. Every country different interest. Every country different degree of the friendship. So that's why to gather that all 27 countries and to make one single solid China policy is quite difficult, I think. But on the other hand, I understand, for example, especially Germany and France, they need more, proactive role of the European Union. It means that seriously connect with some kind of the containment of the China. But on the other hand, European countries and Japan heavily depend on Chinese market and the Chinese economy. So in this sense, it's kind of the balance we need, I think.
Thank you so much, Takashi. For a moment, we will continue discussion by opening the floor to David Hutt, who is about to continue the geopolitics, discussing the geopolitics of Japanese situation and its rapprochement with European Union. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to sit, if you don't mind. I believe I'm the only speaker here today who isn't a Japan expert. And I also believe, since one of the other speakers couldn't make it, I'm also the only journalist speaking today. My specialism is Asian geopolitics. For 5 years, I was based in Southeast Asia, covering US-China relations in Southeast Asia, from Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, all around. Now I'm back in Europe, based between the UK and Czech Republic, and I cover Europe-Asia relations. My fellow speakers have done a wonderful job of explaining the bilateral importance of the EPA and SPA and Japan's security concerns. I apologize if I repeat anything, because it's already been said by my colleagues. It's the occupational hazard of going last in events like this. And Takashi done a wonderful job in explaining the security issue, so I'll try and leave most of that out of mine. I don't want to repeat what you've said. So I'd like to expand the debate a little and talk about the importance of the EPA and SPA in terms of how the rest of the world understands it and how it impacts on our new Cold War between the US and China. The EPA and SPA aren't just bilateral agreements. Prime Minister Abe called the deals, quote, a new era for Japan and the EU. But he also noted they send, quote, a strong message to the world. That strong message is of two of the world's largest economies, after securing the world's largest trade deal, committed to a number of agreed policies: multilateralism, free trade, international rule of law, sustainable development. The EU and Japan agreements also stand in direct contrast to Donald Trump's America First policy. And they stand in direct contrast to China's mercantile system, and especially its aggression in places like the East China Sea and South China Sea. But there's also an insinuation between the closer relationship between the EU and Japan that it offers an alternative to the US-China conflict, a kind of third pole, a median between the two. And a closer relationship between the EU and Japan offers other countries around the world that are concerned about the polarization between the US and China an alternative for investment, and an alternative as Washington and Beijing seem to be committed to carving up most of the world into spheres of influence, especially in Indo-Pacific. And I don't think we can understand the current discussions about EU-Japan relations without understanding how the geopolitical shift has happened since 2017. And it seems to me that if those shifts didn't happen in 2017 with the rise of Trump and the reaction of Beijing, maybe the EU and Japan wouldn't have given so much importance to the EPA and SPA in the symbolic nature of them. And we'll probably be talking very differently here today if Hillary Clinton had won and hadn't changed the international system. I'll try to make two arguments, one optimistic, but most pessimistic. The optimistic one is that the EU-Japan relationship can be expanded significantly, especially for much of the world. And they can cooperate to offer trade alternatives to countries that don't want to depend entirely on the US and China. It seems abundantly clear that the EU-Japan economic deal has provided the space and also precedent for the EU to make similar trade deals with other Asian partners. We saw one with Singapore last year, one with Vietnam agreed last month finally. There's another one with Thailand now, which might be picked up. Others with Malaysia and Indonesia, if we can move past the palm oil situation. My pessimistic argument is that this can only go so far, however, and even a much stronger EU and Japan on the world stage cannot fundamentally change our geopolitical system. I was in Vietnam in February 2019 when the EPA came into effect. I was there to cover the Trump-Kim Peace Summit, so I was there for a month. And when I spoke to my sources inside the Communist Party and the civilian Vietnamese government, most of them wanted to talk about EU and Japan and not Trump and Kim. For them, the EU and Japan really mattered. Last year, Japan was the largest investor in Vietnam, whereas China was only third. And last year, the EU was Vietnam's second largest export market. The United States is number one. But yet, Vietnam risks yet again becoming a proxy area of conflict in a new Cold War. It came close to military conflict last year with China after Chinese vessels spent most of a year trying to intimidate Vietnamese firms drilling for oil in the South China Sea. And this relationship means that now Vietnam is dependent on the US for security. So much so that most people say Vietnam's its closest ally in Southeast Asia. But what Vietnam wants more than anything is pluralism, and pluralism in foreign relations. The same goes to most of the Indo-Pacific. They all want to be friends with as many countries as possible. And what government officials in Hanoi were telling me last year was that they think a stronger EU and Japan on the world stage, and especially an EU-Japan which works better together, can offer an alternative to the split and maybe prevent the new Cold War turning hot, especially in areas like Southeast Asia, where the old Cold War did turn hot. And the EU and Japan also seem to desire a more independent role for themselves in the international system. At the Munich Security Conference last month, the German president spoke a good deal about the need for European independence. He said, "Only a Europe that can win and wants to protect itself credibly will be able to keep the US in an alliance." Von Leyen, the new European Commission president, has said that her commission will be a geopolitical one. The insinuation of that is that the EU was weak before, and now it needs to play a more active role. Last year, the EU finally called China a systemic rival, and Japan's annual defense white paper last year said, quote, "China engages in unilateral coercive attempts to alter the status quo, based on its assertions that are incompatible with the existing international order. What I think is needed is more cooperation between the EU and Japan, and on that I'm fairly confident that can happen. We saw the EU and Japan sign an infrastructure deal last year to coordinate investment spending across Asia. And clearly this was intended to offer alternatives to countries in Asia for China's BRI. I think something similar, an agreement between EU and Japan to more closely align on investment in somewhere like the Balkans would also be a good idea. I think you can also see it more at a diplomatic and a smaller level as well. I lived in Cambodia for 5 years, as well as based in Southeast Asia. And just before I left, there was a large project along Phnom Penh's riverside. They were knocking most of it down and trying to build something new. The tender, there was no tender, sorry, immediately the project went to a Chinese company. But the EU and Japanese embassies behind doors managed to convince the Cambodian government to put it out for open tender. It wasn't a massive deal. It hardly made the headlines, especially not international headlines. And the project still went to a Chinese company. But the Cambodian government earned considerably more for it. And by pressuring the Cambodian government to be open, the deal had to be transparent. We were able to see exactly how much investment was going on, where the money was coming from, which is hardly ever an option with most BRI deals. So I think the fact that the EU-Japan infrastructure deals and investment deals come with conditions on environmental and fiscal sustainability should be applauded, and I think they're going to be welcomed by many in Asia. The fear of the debt traps is rising and I think spreading throughout most of the region now. The EU can help Japan expand its trade relations in places like Central and Eastern Europe, and especially in the Balkan states. Those who are not yet part of the European Union. When Prime Minister Abe made his first visit to Europe in January 2018, the first time a sitting Japanese Prime Minister had visited Europe in more than a century, he made sure to visit the Balkans, and in particular Serbia, which is one of the largest recipients of Chinese investment in Europe. And after he visited Serbia, I thought it was quite important that the former NATO General Secretary said that the, at the time, planned EPA is about freedom, and we need Japan to help. I thought that was quite an interesting comment. And I think, meanwhile, Japan can assist the EU in places where it has more influence, like in Southeast Asia. I think Japan could work behind the doors to pressure Southeast Asian colleagues to make the EU a strategic partner of ASEAN. The EU have been trying to do that for years now. There is a ban on upgrades of partnerships, but I think with some logic it would be important that the EU is on the same level as the US and China in how it understands ASEAN. Now I'm going to be pessimistic and speak about some of the problems. The first problem of if Japan and EU want to play a more independent and active role in global affairs, I think one problem is where they will actually be able to have some influence and expand. In my opinion, it will probably only be in the Indo-Pacific, especially Southeast Asia, and perhaps in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. I can't see EU and Japan building much influence in the Middle East, for example. I can't see them building much influence in Africa, except for the maritime areas and the maritime channels, and certainly not in Latin America. So if this is a plan, or this is the intention, to find a middle path internationally between the US and China, it's going to be very limited to a few regions on the world. I think one reason, maybe in Southeast Asia and the Balkans, why the EU and Japan, can build more influence is it seems the US-China conflict, which maybe I can get back to after in the questions, seems to have evolved from what at the beginning was a geopolitical struggle in those areas and now to a geoeconomic struggle. We've seen massive competition, especially in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, Eastern Africa, as the US tries to be a competitor to China for investment in infrastructure. The US cannot. It's offered up $200 billion, I believe. That's pennies compared to what China is offering. But I think if the EU and Japan can work more closely together, then they can be an alternative source of investment for those countries where the US probably cannot. The other issue, as Takashi has said about security, EU and Japan are not security powers. Japan is still fundamentally beleaguered by the fact if it doesn't know it's a military power and doesn't know how to respond. The EU has no bloc-wide capacity for conflict, and now with Britain leaving the bloc, I'm British, I'm sorry for that, it leaves only France as a security actor. I think instead they could become maybe financiers of other countries' defense sectors, but not the guarantors of peace for other countries. The US will have to remain the guarantor of peace. Japan has showed more signs in the south of getting more active in the South China Sea. This month, Japan donated a ship and $15 million in aid to Indonesia's Coast Guard, its militia, to defend themselves against Chinese aggression. Last month it held more meetings with the Vietnamese military and Vietnamese militia. And also last month, I thought quite importantly, when Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte counseled a decades-old security deal with the United States, a week later, he signed, I believe, the country's largest purchase order for military vessels, and that was from Japan. But the additional problem to that is the cost of Japanese and European arms compared to Chinese military equipment. Beijing can subsidize the losses of its defense contractors because it knows it gets a geopolitical purpose from selling cheap products. In Thailand, in the last 3 years, we've seen the largest defense purchases from Thailand go to China. And I know for a fact that the Chinese contractors and all of us have lost considerably money. They're not making any money on those defense agreements because they're so low, but they're being compensated by Beijing to make up for the geopolitical purpose of it. I think a third problem is how the EU and Japan does diplomacy. At the moment, it seems that Brussels wants to run before it can walk. There's clearly a drive by the EU to become a key international actor as quickly as possible. Von Leyen made much to do about this before becoming president, but she's had to tone down her comments slightly in recent months. Japan, by comparison, seems to take things more slowly and is less prepared to be as direct as the EU in confronting problems in other countries. So take Cambodia again. Last month, the EU partially removed Cambodia from a preferential trade deal in response to political deterioration in Cambodia since 2017. That was quite a big move by the EU. The US hasn't done anything about Cambodia, so this is really the EU taking a lead in an international issue for one of the first times. Japan, however, has decided to maintain full diplomatic and trade relations with Cambodia. And I know for a fact that the EU and US embassies were very, very frustrated that Japan didn't come into an agreement with them to respond more harshly to the Cambodian government at the beginning of the political deterioration. And by trying to have soft diplomacy and backroom diplomacy, many in the EU and US embassies feel that Japan let the side down and wasn't doing enough to actively forestill this political deterioration. And I think that the last and fourth and probably most important is that while the EU and China want to carve out this more independent role for themselves in the international community and perhaps become something of a middle ground, a third pole between the US and China, especially if they can work more closely together, I don't think they can. They can become alternatives for some country for trade and investment, but they won't be able to compete in security matters. EU and Japan are still reliant on China economically, and they're still reliant on the US for security reasons. And I'm slightly skeptical that there doesn't seem anything fundamentally symbiotic in the EU-Japan relationship in the same way there is a necessary symbiosis in other relationships. US and China cannot survive economically without one another. The EU cannot survive without good relations with both the US and China. And Japan cannot. Well, Japan and the EU will both massively suffer if they do not maintain good relationships with the US and China. But if Japan and European relations were to deteriorate, I think there would be a major problem, but it wouldn't be a catastrophe to either side. If we stop trade between Europe and Japan today, there would be problems, but the economies wouldn't spiral into chaos in the same way that the US economy would spiral into chaos for complete decoupling from China, for example. And geopolitics tends to revolve around this necessity. Geopolitics is always about necessity. And at the moment, there seems some necessity between the EU and Japan. My other question is how long that will last. Hypothetically, if Trump was defeated in November, and the US tries to mend its transatlantic relationship with Europe and its trans-Pacific with Japan, and the next US president tones down the rhetoric, anti-China rhetoric, will EU and Japan relationships go back to how they were before, as friends with so much in common but with very little socialization? My concern is that it might be temporary. My other concern is that it might not be temporary, and what are the fundamentally long-term consequences of this new Cold War? I'm a trained historian. I studied history in university, and I always like to try and use applied history. In my opinion, there's three solutions or three avenues to international geopolitics at the moment. The first and obviously most beneficial and desirable would be for US-China relations to go back to how they were pre-2017, back to the days when people used to call Chimerica, right? I don't think that's likely in the future. I think decoupling now has become a reality. I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party will want it so much now that it's very much dependent on nationalism. And also, anti-China seems to be the only bipartisan agreement in America. So I cannot even see it. And if the Democrats win in November, there'd be a fundamental change in how the US responds to China. The second scenario, I've been recently rereading Henry Kissinger's book on China. And Kissinger makes the argument that we shouldn't compare US-China relations to those of the US and Soviet Union. So the new Cold War scenario isn't a good analogy. The US and Soviet Union had very few economic relationships, very few people-to-people relationships. They were basically two entities completely separated. The US and China aren't. So Kissinger makes the comparison to Britain and Germany in the 1900s, which were the largest trading partners of one another, with close people-to-people relationships, with close security relationships. If that's a more reasonable analogy, then the worst-case scenario of our new US-China conflict might be 1914 again. And I think that would be obviously the most undesirable situation. So maybe the new Cold War situation is the best scenario we have at the moment. And maybe this is going to last for 100 years, or maybe it's going to last for another 10 years. If you read people who were writing in the 1950s, it wasn't immediately understandable to them that they were in a Cold War in the 1950s. It only became apparent to many people much later. I think that might be the case now. So I think that if we would look to that and look to what history can teach us, I don't think the EU and Japan can either be, won't be this new non-aligned movement again. I think fundamentally they will have to remain in the security alliances they are and remain part of a US-led order. I don't think there'll be much independence. But we see some progress in this. So in January, the US, EU, and Japan agreed to propose changes to how the World Trade Organization will tackle market distortion. This was clearly China was the target of market distortions from subsidies of their trilateral agreement, but this was a rare trilateral agreement, and it's a sign of, I think, how we're going to move forward in the geopolitical situation. It won't be an independent US and independent EU and Japan between the US and China. I think more likely it will be a closer EU and Japan as the sidekicks of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great comment. Thanks so much. The topic of decoupling, it's very, very much resonating and dark view of the future Cold War. It's the topic that we might continue discussing. We have still 15 minutes left. May I ask you for questions to all, to David, to Yukari, and to Takashi? Questions on the global circumstances that bring Japan and European Union together. United States, which is hesitating how to keep with its role of guarantor of the global international order.
Thank you.
Michal Kolmash.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
Michal Kolmash from Metropolitan University Prague. I'm going to be speaking in one of the afternoon panels. Thank you, David, for the presentation. I thought it was great. Now, I was at the conference in Hungary last month, and the same topic, quite similar, and Mr. Natsuda was there as well, but there was quite a lot of talk about the new Cold War as well there. And frankly, I'm not buying it much. I mean, I can see that there is a shift, and quite visible shift, within the U.S. administration towards China, and I think that anti-China sentiment is present in all levels now, which wasn't the case a few years back, or like 5 years back or so. And I think that not only within the Conservative Party, which is obviously very much the case, but even outside of it, it seems like American administration is being much tougher, and probably will be much tougher on China. But still, that argument that Kissinger made, that I wasn't aware that Kissinger made it, and I wanted to make it here, that the world is just like so much more connected, and I don't think that the analogies of 19th century Europe are quite on the spot here. Now, isn't that really something that might quite limit the possibilities of the war, or new Cold War, that we are actually talking within organization, and even China, even though I've got quite a lot of limitations about China's behavior, it's actually being constructive in quite a lot of these organizations. So is the analogy really good here? Is the analogy really working here? It's I guess my first question, and my second question is Japan, EU role, that stuff that you explained as sort of like sidekicks of the United States, has it any time before been different? I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I don't think that there's anyone else but the United States who can guarantee the security in Asia. But I'm just wondering whether any of these actors really believe that they can do it themselves without American help. Whether they can be something else than just sidekicks of the United States within this, security in East Asia. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Is the analogy to a new Cold War correct? No historical analogy is always 100%, right? It's an analogy. It's not a perfect comparison. Of course, it might play out differently. As I said, I don't think, I would hope that the new Cold War analogy actually is true, because the alternatives, I think, are actually worse. As I said, I would not like to see this conflict escalate even more. There are many analysts now who are predicting a small US-China naval standoff or conflict within the next decade. That will precipitate far more conflict and far more proxy wars in the coming decade. So I would much prefer the analogy to be correct, that this is going to be a Cold War. Is there much progress? I don't know. I think lots of this comes from how the Chinese Communist Party acts and how it acts for its own self-importance. The coronavirus is obviously causing new problems that the CCP has never had to deal with before. So we don't know how it's going to react, right? If we want to look for an historical analogy, many people are comparing this to Chernobyl, right? This is China's Chernobyl. But we only have a few instances of how communist systems fall apart. And we only have two, perhaps, either for a wave of people's, of public protest, or through collapse by reform. So if we're looking for analogies, I don't know how China's going to go forward in the next decade. And I don't think few people will. So I think at the moment, the Cold War is the best analogy we can have. I know that doesn't completely answer your question. The second one, I forgot your second question, sorry.
Japan, EU, US.
Oh, can they be independent? I think there's a determination by some in the EU to have a more independent position going forward for the next few decades. I think, especially, I was in Paris 2 months ago speaking to some government officials, and clearly in France there's a determination to, now that Britain is outside the EU, France can really take control of EU foreign policy. And there seems to be optimism that they can drive it towards a more independent position away from US security. And we've seen that with Macron, obviously. Whether that's achievable or not, I argue against that. But I think there is a determination by some. And I think that the EU's in a state of flux at the moment. Brexit was a big shock. I think what's happening in Hungary and Poland is also a shock to the EU. How it responds to the values of internal member states. And it seems a good time to focus on foreign policy when there's many, many domestic problems within the EU. So I can see them pushing foreign policy more, maybe in order to sidetrack and to obscure the domestic problems at the heart of the EU.
The issue of Cold War, it's really very attractive, and I believe it will be circulating, and it's in the air. But on the other hand, we live in an era of fluctuations and inflations of words and meanings. So actually, US and China are strategic partners, which was signed under the President Clinton, if I remember. European Union signed a strategic partnership with China in 2003. Now we Europeans are in position that we redefine our strategic partner as a strategic rival or strategic competitors. So this is like a crisis in partnerships. It's that could be brought on the level of the top politics. Do we have some more questions about the decoupling, about the space for Japan for maneuvering under the pressure of hesitating from the US support? Some more questions about the European Union, about the prospects of free trade agreements and economic partnership agreements. So we have just 10 minutes. I would suggest to each of the panelists just to define 3 basic points that would summarize our debate. Let me start, but because okay, great.
I'm Michael Krawczeniuk from Polish Embassy. I would like to ask 2 questions to Mr. Takashi. First, is there a consensus in Japanese society about removing the amendment in the constitution about the no army, or it's still the debate about it? And the second question is about the modern relationships between South Korea and worsening relationship, and if this will push Japan to more into European Union relations, like to try to find alternative because of this worsening relationship between South Korea and Japan. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much for questions. At the first about the amendment of the Constitution, I think as far as I know that there is no consensus about the amendment of the constitutions. Of course, the Prime Minister Abe, primarily he wants to change or amend the constitution. But still, there are so many arguments, and especially so many people recognize, okay, we need some, the amendment of the constitution. But the amendment of the constitution is not automatically mean the amendment of Article 9, the war renouncing clause, right? So in this sense, yeah, the Japanese constitution is since 1947, there's no untouchable, not changed, not amended. So that's why, in some extent, we need some amendment. But about Article 9, war renouncing clause, I think that we should keep this Article 9. It's a kind of the Japan's the post Second World War pride. And also the pacifism is quite important to core the Japan's foreign policy. So in the sense, especially under the current situation, I mean the expanding the pandemic, with the coronavirus and the other issues, domestic issues, the Prime Minister Abe faces on very, very hard difficulties, and his support ratio is decreasing. So in this sense, I think in near future, there is a quite low possibility to achieve by Prime Minister to amend the Constitution. And the second question, yeah, also it's quite important, directly related with Japan's defense. I'm seriously concerned about the relation between South Korea and Japan, and especially that this concern is, yeah, of course, anti-Japanese feeling or anti-Japanese movement in South Korea and in China is quite tradition. The ways we face on this kind of the anti-Japanese feelings, but in China, Chinese Communist Party had ruling roles. If the Chinese Communist Party said white, everything should be white, right? But in South Korea is democratic countries, the parliamentary democracy. So in this sense, the South Korean people, yeah, of course, it's under the strong influence on the media, but South Korean people, by themselves, choice and increase the anti-Japanese feeling, especially under the current Moon administration. But on the other hand, I think that I believe the official levels, the both sides, I mean, the Japanese government and South Korean government is very cool and they prefer to keep the better relations. Because, and also the United States, in some extent, push the both government to cool down to prevent the worsening the relations. So in the sense, I hope, at least, for example, that through this kind of crisis we are now facing on in South Korea and Japan, and also during this coronavirus problems, the North Korea launched, for example, yesterday, North Korea launched 4 short-range ballistic missiles to Sino-Japan, right? So in the sense, still, we need some kind of the cooperation. And if the Moon administration start to recognize more the North Korea as a national threat, we can increase the sphere and area of the cooperation between Japan and South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. We have last 5 minutes left, so let me give the idea just to define 3 keywords to summarize this panel. I will begin. I'll ask the other colleagues to follow. My 3 keywords would be doubts. We live in era of doubts. We are losing ground. We hesitate. We are afraid of rising China, and we are facing to some new complicated world that we do not understand so much. My second point is partnerships. Amidst the feeling of doubts, we are seeking for other partnerships. We established many, and some works, some do work, some do not. But we Europeans believe that Japan, it's very attractive partner, because not just economy, but also because of the shared values and understanding on the international politics. And the third point that I suggest, this is a crisis of mobility. Not just because of the epidemic, we lost some speakers who could not unfortunately come to join us, but this is the crisis of maybe globalization. There are my 3 points. My colleagues, please, David.
2 easy ones, power and weakness. Let me try a comical one. There's a new term going around UK politics now, which is cakeism. This comes from Boris Johnson, who wants to have his cake and eat it. So cakeism is now a political term in the UK. And I think cakeism defines quite a lot, maybe to answer the last question the gentleman asked me, I think it defines a lot about what the EU wants from foreign policy. I think it wants to have its cake and to eat it. It wants closer relations with everyone. It wants to stand up for itself. It wants to be independent. It wants to be critical. But it doesn't want any of the negative impacts of that. So cakeism maybe is a good word.
Thanks.
Okay, my 3 keywords is trust and sustainability and connectivity. I like David's question, whether this EU-Japan partnership continue in the long term. So I always keep asking myself, is this time different? Because in the past, EU-Japan has several, epoch-making declarations, something, but still the relationships are kind of stable, low-key. But as my experience as a negotiator, this EPA, SPA is not just the agreement, but it has more than 5 to 7 years hard work to communicate each other, exchange opinions and interaction. So through this process, I felt actually EU-Japan created a very strong tie and mutual understanding. And before, for example, Japanese government not so much understand about the EU's policy about sustainable trade and sustainable development importance. But in the end, Japan appreciated this approach, and also the geographic indication. This is quite new for Japan. We didn't understand why we should protect many products in a local production. But finally, we introduced this system. That means not only surface, but we need to change the deep inside our society. So this EPA has certain fundamental change created, and it's not just 15 minutes fame, but I think it would last longer. And this is the sustainability of EU-Japan relationship. And the connectivity. in this session, I'm not so familiar with security issues, but I learned much. And also I felt the security issue and the economic issues much more connected to each other. And that's the reason why in my presentation, pointed out the comprehensive, heuristic, systematic cooperation approach. So I think this connectivity point of view is also now EU and Japan share. So I hope this relationship is, really different from the before. Thank you.
So much. And Takashi, the last one.
Okay, it's very simply. The first one is dependency on the United States. We need the United States, even though the president is Trump or not. Actually, we need, we heavily depend on the security sphere, the United States. It is not possible to deny it. But on the other hand, the Japan, European Union European countries can share the common rules and norms. The second keyword is common rules and norms. And through this sharing the common rules and norms, the third keyword is substantive cooperation. Now we need to more increase and improve the substantial cooperation instead of the kind of the negotiation. Thank you.
Many thanks to David, Yukari, and Takashi for great contributions. And our panel is ending. Thank you so much for your attention. We take a break for 1 hour, and we take the lunch now, and the next panel starts at 1 o'clock. Thank you.